Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to How to Manage Your Grant, offered by the Office of Sponsored Programs and Grants Management. I'm Tom Cruz, the director of the office. And in case you're not familiar with us, we are located in 232 Cook Hall. So before we get started with how to manage your grant, it's first important to talk about the life cycle of a grant. This illustration here will give you a good idea of the process and the time it takes to submit a grant and to manage the grant throughout the life of the award on up to closeout. So if you look at the areas in gray, that's essentially what we call the pre-award areas. And what we're talking about there is project development, where we work with you on developing concepts for your project that will ultimately go into a competitive proposal application. But before we do that, we identify funding opportunities that are good, viable sources that you can go after that would yield a good, reasonable success in terms of sponsoring that wants to fund your application. And then we get into the proposal preparation part where our office helps out with things of certain characteristics of the project to include boilerplate type forms, budgets, and budget narratives, and other administrative forms that are often required when you submit a grant. And then ultimately, the last part of the pre award process ends with the submission of the proposal. And that's again handled by the Office of Sponsored Programs. And what we're talking about in with proposal submissions usually is applications that are emailed to the sponsor. Some sponsors have their own websites or their own web portals, particularly the federal government. And again, that's something that Sponsored Programs does. And that certainly takes that administrative burden off of you as the grant writer. What we're specifically here to talk about today is the red parts, which is essentially called post award, the management of the grant. That includes the acceptance of the award. When proposals are submitted, usually it takes months before funding decisions are made by the sponsors, and those funding decisions are given to Radford in form of MOUs, contracts, grant reward agreements. So there's various different types of funding that the office handles. And internally, what we do with that, we set up your project in Banner. So you and your department will have a FOAP identifying with specific identifiers that are tied to your project. And the award management is basically the day-to-day post award of what we do to help out our faculty with managing grants. Those can be questions that faculty members and departments have with respect to the award, the terms and conditions of the award, how to spend money, and that sort of thing. And then wrapping it all up when the grant's over, there is a last process called the closeout period. And those usually involve your reporting, final reconciliations of the account, final billing the sponsor to claim reimbursements on some of our costs that haven't been paid. And then ultimately, once that process is done, the file is closed and goes into record retention. So if you look at the roles of sponsored programs, as mentioned, we do help out with pre-award administration, again, helping you find funding opportunities as well as sitting down with you one-on-one to conceptualize your projects. And we also offer other types of support as well, finding funding. We do have external consultants on staff that we can reach out to and help you for services that go above and beyond what we can provide. Banner account setup, as we mentioned, once we get a grant in, what the sponsored programs office does is we set up your account. We work with the budget office, financial reporting office to get appropriate numbers in place and the appropriate budget in place in Banner so that you can start spending. And then ultimately what happens with that is once you get a grant, or for those that have won a grant, you might be familiar with this. What we do is we send out an email to basically a lot of individuals in the university committee that has a role or responsibility with helping the office with the grant. So those offices are, in addition to the PI, of course, in his or her department and college, those offices are also procurement, HR, um, the budget office, and others as well. And again, our NOGAs notices, which we call NOGAs, have specific information about the grant, who the sponsor is, the term of the grant, and the budget amount, of course. And then there's also some other characteristics, but essentially it just basically lets people know that Professor X won a grant and his or her award information is characterized as such based on the information that we blast out. Post award administration, just so that you know, our post award staff comprises of 3 administrators that are that work with you in terms of helping manage the day-to-day activities of the grant, answering questions, being that valuable resource that we like to provide, and also participate. And also our outreach. What we're doing now is to share information with you to help better your life as a researcher. And some of the other information that we would like to share about the post award area, we are divided based on, for the most part, colleges and academic units. So if you're in a particular college, let's say, for an example, the College of Education, you will work with one post award administrator, which is Katie Davis. And Katie handles all of our Department of Education funding, or excuse me, our College of Education funding. So you essentially work with one person, so you don't have to go around, around and around to other people in the office. However, we are cross trained to where if one of our staff members are out, the next staff member up should have proper training to help you and assist you in any immediate concerns. And then one last thing about our post award, we do offer support for our internal grants. So if you're not familiar with that, our internal grant program is called our Seed Grant Program, where you can apply for internal funding opportunities up to $10,000. These opportunities come out every month with rolling deadlines. And when you win a seed grant, you'll be working with one post award administrator on that, and it's still the same process, right? So that individual will work with you on spending down the budget and answering any questions, or again, providing that valuable resource to you. So one of the biggest areas that we're often faced with when you talk about the post award administration of a grant throughout its life cycle, it's the grant accounting. It's the biggest part. Grant accounting primarily comprises of how you spend the money. Obviously, when budgets go into the sponsor, budgets are often estimates that we propose to the sponsor that we anticipate spending X number of dollars on these categories. However, time to time, as grants go on, things change, and there are some flexibility with respect to moving budgets around in other line items. Sometimes you have to get the sponsor's approval, but oftentimes those are allowed for us to do without going back to the sponsor. So regardless of what budget really we're working with, whether it's the existing budget that was in our original proposal or the revised budget that we simply shifted around ourselves, we're under certain regulations, right? So starting with the federal government, if it's a federal grant, it's going to be tied to specific federal regulations as codified under 2 CFR 200. CFR stands for Code of Federal Regulations, and these are essentially a document that's been legislatively put together by the federal government that spells out the rules and regulations on how to spend grant funding and other areas as well. But we'll focus on spending on this slide. So what does that mean? It talks about cost liability, allocability, and reasonableness. So basically, things that are in your budget where you've said that you're going to spend on the grant, but also you've determined those costs to be allowable, allocable, and reasonable. Allocability is basically if you have a couple different projects going on, and say, as an example, you buy a piece of equipment and that equipment is going to be shared on 2 different grants. So the government certainly allows you to split those costs for whatever proportionate that the equipment is being used on each grant, whether it's 50-50 or 70-30. So again, we want to make sure that what in most particular in equipment that we want to make sure that if we're charging equipment to a grant, that that equipment is being used 100% on the project. And again, if equipment is being used on other types of activities to include in the department, there might often be times where we have to only the grant can pay for a certain amount of that or equipment, right? And then the cost, whatever that cost is that the grant's not paying for, it's charged somewhere else. But those are just quick examples of that type of instance. In addition to federal regulations, whether we're talking about a federal grant or non-federal grant, you're always going to have state and university regulations, um, such as how you hire people on grants, buying of goods and services. So that would be working with our purchasing office and through EVA, and then travel, right? So obviously there's a lot of travel that goes on grants, whether you're going to professional conferences to disseminate the results that you've generated from the project, or just if a lot of your work pertains to field work, then obviously there might be some cost incurred for traveling, to and from research sites. And so what basically these regulations are like your common regulations that you would normally have if you were paying for these items on your E&G account. So what the federal government basically says, if it's a federal grant, they unless it's specifically written in the award that says otherwise, usually through federal grants, they're going to allow you to charge items in accordance with your policies and procedures. Again, there's some instances where federal language supersedes what the state and university regulations are, but for the most part, you're going to be using the policies and procedures that have been set forth by the institution. And then, a third area that some of you may have received is the Radford University Foundation funding. Those policies are also can be different than what we've experienced through other types of grants, and the difference is usually tied to particular types of forms that you have to submit, and those are the FO1, FO2 forms. We won't go into great detail about the foundation projects, but I just wanted to call your attention to that there could be some separate guidelines in that. However, I will say ultimately, once the funds come from the foundation to the university, since they now are university funds, it reverts back to your university regulations. Let's talk a little bit about HR, and how to create and hire positions with external funding. Obviously, you must follow human resources policies and procedures, and you'll find this same theme throughout the slide. Is even though it's grant funded and it runs through sponsor programs, doesn't matter what the color of the money is, right? Whether it's federal money, state money, or it's foundation money, we have to follow all of our university policies and procedures. So if you're hiring anybody, we gotta follow HR's policies, right? So many of you know this, but a lot of times we're here to assist you and coach you up on the two different types of forms, and there could be multiple forms as well. I just picked these two forms because that's mostly what we deal with in sponsor programs as we help people on grants, help people help departments hire people, and that's completing the PR 23 and the PR 40. Again, these are HR forms, and I would advise everybody to go out to their website and not only get acquainted with the forms, but also look at their instructions. I think they do publish instructions how to complete the forms. But as always, please reach out to your post-award administrator, and we can be able to help coach you up on completing the forms. But again, I just wanted to illustrate, since this is a grant, we still have to follow our our HR guidelines. And that includes advertising, using people admin. Obviously, you do that anyway. We're okay. So as long as HR is okay, once you know that we have a grant in place, that if you're hiring anybody on a grant on people admin, that you can immediately go out and advertise for the position. Usually you'll need a phone number or an account number. We can rearrange that through different mechanisms through underwriting. But what we tell people to get ahead of the recruitment and the hiring process is to, work with HR. Don't wait till your grant monies get here. Go ahead and start the process with HR, so you can at least try to get the advertisement in place. Because again, the advertisement is for a restricted position and it's predicated on funding anyway. But again, to keep with timelines and and things that are grant expectations, the earlier you start this process, the better. And again, we can help facilitate a lot of that. When you do hire somebody on a grant, right? So these are restricted positions, and usually they're only valid for or they expire after a year. At most, right? I mean, you might have some that have a shorter hiring period, but let's just say you're hiring somebody on a grant and your grant's multi-year. So you have a 3-year project and you're hiring a individual into Radford. Once that individual's hired, each year you got to go in and modify that existing position, essentially extending their term in EPAF. Again, that's something that we can help you with, because a lot of folks don't realize that, these are restricted positions with end dates that should mirror usually it mirrors the end date of your project. But if your project ever gets extended, yeah, you got to go in and extend those individuals as well. For hiring students, and again, if you have any questions, just feel free to chime in. I'll try my best to keep up with the chat. I'm not always good at multitasking, so if you want to just chime in, go ahead. But one of the areas too that we often see is hiring students. 2 different types of students: undergraduate students and graduate students. For undergraduate students, now that we're under a new rate, obviously that rate's $15 an hour. That's the minimum hourly rate that you obviously will need to use for a undergraduate student, but it could be more, right? It depends on, the student's expertise, and but the baseline rate for the undergraduate student is $15 an hour. And then the hours worked obviously is still, in accordance with the university's policies or procedures on that. On our grants, we kind of mirror the graduate student workload, like no more than 20 hours a week, right? So they're here to concentrate on their, curriculum or their course of study, not to be overworked, I guess I should say. So you want to stick to those types of hours. So typically when we budget in students at the undergraduate rate, it's it's $15 an hour, no more than 20 hours. And then whether you want them to work in the fall, the whole semester, the whole academic year is fine. If they're enrolled full time, you're not going to be charged fringe benefits. So I know that's a question that we get a lot. But if you want to hire them in the summer, which is certainly permissible to do on grants, so as long as you have the funding, usually they're not enrolled, at least in summer class. And if they are, they're usually not enrolled full time. So if they're not enrolled full time, they're going to be assessed the FICA, the 7.65. So do know that when you're hiring students, same for grad, and I'll talk about grad here in a minute. But if you're hiring students on your projects, you want to and if they're during the academic year and they're enrolled full time, you're not going to get assessed the FICA. So again, that's good to know for budgeting and planning purposes. For the graduate student rates, what we do is we try to mirror the graduate school on how they appoint their GAs, their graduate assistantship. So we use the same rates as the graduate school uses, and essentially the same hours worked, right? Not to exceed 20 hours.
Tom, can I ask a question about the student stuff?
That's Stockton. Yep.
I'm applying for an REU, supplemental REU for my grant, and I'm not sure if that's is that a student hiring process if I had two specific students, or is that kind of a different process for payment?
So yeah, so with the hiring of students, there have been some flexibility to where we can pay student stipends. Again, it's all contingent on the level of work. When you're hiring students, versus like a stipend, right? So through the HR process, through hiring students, there's kind of like, yes, even though there are students and that's their primary, existence here on campus, it's essentially a job, right? So there's expectations that the students are going to work, whatever, like these sets of hours, and they're going to perform these tasks for you for these particular duties on the grant. Whereas, you can pay student stipends to be participants, right? So more like, I don't want to call them fellowships or scholarship type payments, but essentially stipends can take any form. But really, what we see stipends as being is, lump sum payments or whatever to students who are, participating on the project that's tied to his or her course of study, where there's not really any expectation for them in terms of like what you would consider like an employee would be, even though students aren't employees.
Yeah,
And
'cause I was just wondering if that same pool of money also, like for an REU, would you have FICA involved with that then too?
so no, so if it's right, so if you're going through, if we're hiring these students through, payroll or through HR, and like I said, they're enrolled full time, there'll be no FICA.
Yeah.
And with again, we can talk when we write the grant, but if they're receiving some other type of remuneration, like a stipend or whatever, that doesn't even run through payroll. That comes out of a different line item. So there will be no FICA assessed on that. So it sounds like if you're using students, we just got to figure out what the students are doing to how to appropriately categorize them. But it sounds like either way, the students are probably not going to be assessed FICA.
Okay, appreciate it.
Yeah, and again, that's a great question. And again, that's something that our pre-award team can help out with as well as you think about the budget and build the budget. Yeah, and like I said, graduate students, we kind of mirror the GA appointments and how the graduate school does that. But I do know though that they are not on assistantships. So that if you do hire graduates, much like the undergraduate students, if you do hire graduate students through HR, through payroll, then they're going to have to do timesheets. So you're going to have to keep up with their time and sign off on that. Other types of hiring that you could think of in terms of on grants, hiring other faculty, and in some cases hiring other staff. And it's not on the slide, but I can talk about that too. But hiring faculty, that can be faculty members who are academic year or faculty members who are calendar year. And that can mean hiring new people on grants. Obviously, I don't think we've ever had a grant that we brought in brand new faculty members, um, to 9-month faculty members, 100% on grants. But in this case, what we talk about AY faculty is release time, right? So whether you're a PI on a project or you want to have people assist you on working on projects on your project, like as a co-PI or whatever, then if they need release time, while that's not a true hire, we help out with that process in terms of making sure their time's charged to the grant, and then the savings come back to the department to pay for the class or the course. Or 9-month faculty members can charge summer stipends, right? So if you have a federal project, Stockton mentioned the REU project that is funded by the National Science Foundation. So if you are 9-month faculty members, most sponsors will allow for 9-month faculty members to receive extra compensation in the summertime to work on projects. I know. Let's keep moving on. All right. Sorry, there's a little bit of delay here in this conference room. So, is everybody good with HR hiring? We just wanted to basically illustrate that the common things that we see in terms of hiring are, students and then other faculty members. If you have another person that you want to hire on the grant, but they're not a part of Radford, that's going to come under a different line item that I'll talk about later in the slides. But if there are no questions, we'll move on to procurement of goods and services. So that's probably the second biggest thing we see on grants. So the number one is obviously personnel. Number two is buying goods and services. And again, just like the HR process, you have to follow the university and state policies and procedures. And I would encourage everybody to keep this link handy. This link is the university's procurement manual that the folks over in purchasing keep a good job keeping that up to date and in conformance with state regs. So if you click on that link, it'll give you a series of their policies and procedures to include the procurement manual that you can look at. Well, it's rich in information in terms of how to procure things and what are the thresholds in doing that, like small purchases versus large purchases, outsourcing, bidding versus sole source. But yeah, it's good information that's out there. So the types of procurement that we do see on grants or within grants budgets are obviously your purchasing of your materials and supplies, and purchasing of equipment, technology, and other fixed assets. That can be a little different based on the dollar value. There are two different types of dollar values in terms of thresholds. And what we mean by capitalized thresholds is when, fixed assets come out and tag a technology, whether it's your computer or you have some large piece of instrumentation in your lab, right? So, the university's capitalization threshold on equipment is $2,000 versus the federal acquisition threshold is $5,000. So anything under $5,000, the federal government really doesn't consider it equipment. However, since we do, we have to keep up with it as equipment, and it's got to follow all of the policies and procedures. Where we would love the federal government to be aligned with our policies and procedures, sometimes you'll find in grants that the two are kind of opposite, or even in this extreme opposite in terms one says 2,000, one says 5,000, but we got to follow the state. So anything that you buy on a grant that's over $2,000, if we're talking about equipment, then it's going to be capitalized and recorded in the fixed asset system. Most grants, though, when you purchase equipment on grants, the title's vested to the institution. So even though, let's just say, picking on National Science Foundation again. So if you have an NSF grant and you buy equipment, whether it's, computers or a laptop or some sort of high-end instrumentation, whatever the case may be, the title is going to automatically be transferred to the institution upon acquisition. So what the government expects is for that equipment to be used on the project. And then once the project's over with, they'll allow Radford to keep the equipment, knowing that we're going to use it on future research or other research. And also other types of procuring goods and services are external partners. And external partners, I will define that as being subawards. And on some of our grants, we've had faculty members want to learn a little bit more about, okay, what's a subaward and what's a vendor? And they're two distinct, separate entities, right? Defined differently within the Code of Federal Regulations. Subawards are essentially going to be your co-PIs, right? So external entities that you would deem as being a co-investigator. And what that essentially means is they're going to help you run the project. So they will have some sort of say in the programmatic direction of your project. And also probably, well, not probably, but also they will co-author any sort of scholarship, publications, presentations, whatever with you. So, right. So if you're working with individual or entities that have that sort of significant say in the projects, then chances are they're going to be a subaward. And if they're a subaward, then um, you will work with sponsor programs, and we will work and ensure that they're categorized as a subaward in our budgets, and that once we get the grants, they will send us invoices where we'll pay them to based on how our agreements read, which is usually they'll bill us monthly for their cost. So, and then that's different from a vendor. So subawards requires more government oversight. So the federal government's really stringent on placing responsibilities on recipients of federal funds who sub-grant out their funds to have extra authority and extra auditing capabilities so that we can make sure that these subrecipients are adhering to the federal rules and regulations. So for those, so how it works on the other end. So again, going back to the example, if we get a grant from Virginia Tech that's funded by the national side, or let's say it's funded by the U.S. Department of Education. They give the money to Tech, who sub-grants us a piece of the money. And as I mentioned earlier, we're going to count that as federal funding on our end. And the same thing at Virginia Tech, they're going to consider Radford as a subrecipient, and they're going to flow down a lot of federal provisions, and they're going to treat us and audit us like they're an extension of the federal government. And we would do that if it was reciprocated, we would do that. If federal funds come directly from here and we sub-grant out to Virginia Tech, then we would do the same thing. So there's defined responsibilities, not just on the programmatic side, but also on the fiduciary side on how to manage subawards. That's different than a vendor. So a vendor is essentially, different from a subaward. They're not going to have programmatic say. They're essentially an entity that thrives and competes in the competitive market like a company would, like any other business would. So whether you buy a laptop through Dell, some sort of service that's what they provide on a normal basis, right? So those are vendors and vendors are not subject to any of the federal requirements, like if this was federal funding, right? So example, if Stockton mentioned he has an REU award and he gets the grant in from the National Science Foundation. Let's say Stockton has computers that he wants to buy for the undergraduate students, right? As part of their research. So we would buy the Dell computers, but we wouldn't expect Dell to follow NSF's policies and procedures. So that's kind of the biggest distinction between the two. One's heavily governed and the other one's not. And then two, another big thing that we see is external consultants. So you'll have external consultants on your projects, or I should say expertise that we can't find here on this campus. And that's okay. We can go out and hire those individuals externally through the procurement process, much like evaluators. So sometimes the grants we write, particularly particularly those education grants that we write, or curriculum development type grants that we write, the sponsors often make us budget in external evaluators, right? And obviously to have a great evaluator and limit bias and all that, we'd want to make sure that individual's external evaluator, right? So then we would work with the procurement office on getting contracts in place to do that. Does anybody have any questions on procuring goods and services? It's a big slide. I've got some more to talk about. I will say, so when you go back to the purchasing of materials and supplies, and a comment came in, which is great. What we mean by purchasing materials and supplies are more or less your technical type supplies, right? Not office supplies or office materials. Most of the time, sponsors will not pay for office supplies like pens, paper, and that sort of thing. Now, there are exceptions. Sometimes we have grants where we're generating a lot of paper and doing surveys and whatnot. And of course, there's sometimes exceptions, but general rule of thumb is when we talk about purchasing materials and supplies, it's more or less like field supplies, technical supplies, anything that you need that's not deemed to be dual use or used in the office. So we're focusing in on procuring because it's a big thing, it's a big item, and I know we've had, I don't want to say we've had issues in the past. We've had a lot of questions in the past, just not only just how do I do it, right? You obviously you go through EVA and you work with procurement, but what about how do you plan ahead? What's the best strategies that will give you the most expedient way to procure goods and services so that your project's not derailed by a lengthy timeline, administrative timeline by getting all these pieces together. So what you need to do really is identify a valid need for the goods and services. And that's usually done at the budget at the upfront stage. So when we write proposals, right, we'll work with you on the budget and we'll ask you these questions, right? So do you plan on providing goods and services and what are they? So that's obviously key because when you write those things into your grant proposal, when you get the funding, when you get the award, then you would already have that written in there to where you don't have to go back and ask the sponsor for, hey, is it okay for me to buy this type of item, right? You already had that identified in your proposal application. And again, this goes without saying, but ensuring that the funding and the budget is available. You want to make sure. Always check with sponsor programs, though. So these are some key bullet points so that you can you can quickly get things done, for lack of better words. So yeah, obviously contact sponsor programs, right, to make sure that there are funding in the budget, in the, let's say, equipment, in the equipment line to cover that piece of equipment you're buying. If it's not, maybe there's money elsewhere within the budget. We can certainly, in most cases, shift funds from one budget category to the next so that you have money there to buy your item. Another thing, reach out to the contract officer in the Department of Procurement and Contracts or Purchasing as early as possible in the planning process. I should have said that too in the HR slide. It's always a great benefit if you reach out to these offices ahead of time and let them know what you're doing, because there's some things that they can help you out with, to include, procurement or purchasing, to include, there may be a contract already in place that another school in Virginia has, right? So if there's another school or state entity in Virginia that has a contract with this particular company, and you can use that company within your project, then that way we can just camp on to that contract, right? So that'll eliminate bidding and all this other thing. So again, this was on this prior link that I sent about purchasing's website, but I think they have a link. If not, you can certainly contact them. But it's called VASCUP. It's basically all the contracts in Virginia and who has them. So you can quickly go out on this website and see, because that's sometimes that we do when we have faculty come in. They're like, they want to buy this thing or whatever. And then we can go out there and look at the VASCUP website. Anybody can. You can query it by vendor or by commodity too, I think. And you can kind of see if there is an actual contract in place and what school has it. And that way, we can, we can camp onto that contract. And essentially, I don't want to say bypass all the rules and regulations, but it's basically, it's an accelerated path for you. It could be an accelerated path for you. And, another thing, do know that there's various different thresholds when procuring things. Much like with the equipment, as I said, the equipment threshold is $2,000 at Radford, but $5,000 for federal government. There's different dollar thresholds for procuring on state and federal as well. As you can see, the dollar threshold for goods and the non-professional services are, 5,000 or less, 5,000 to 100,000. Each of these three bullet items, again, it's on purchasing's website, but each of these three bullet points have different criteria. Obviously, if you're purchasing something 5,000 or less, you're going to have less of administrative paperwork, let's just say, to do, versus if you're going to buy something greater than 100,000. And then also, with that said, when you talk about small dollar purchases, sole source versus competitive bid or small dollar purchases, you have, $200,000 or less with the state. This constitutes as small dollar purchases. That has less of an impact or less of administrative impact on you than what you would for if you're buying more. So I just wanted to compare and contrast the difference. So the state says 200,000 or less, well, the federal government says $100,000 or less. So again, if you do have federal funding, and we probably got to pick the most restricted one. So if anything that's more than $100,000, then the government's going to the government doesn't deem that as a small dollar purchase, which means you're probably going to have to bid it. However, there is language in the federal government guidelines that state that if you specifically name a vendor in your proposal application, this is federal, this isn't state, this is federal. So if you specifically name a vendor in your grant application, then that constitutes as sole source, right? So you don't have to bid it because you've already named them within the federal government. The federal government, by virtue of giving you an award, has approved that. So what we tell faculty members in purchasing, if you know who the vendor is, go ahead and write them specifically in the grant. And usually where that goes is in the budget justification. I mean, you could put it in the narrative depending on how your project narrative, depending on how you're going to write the grant, but usually those things go in the budget justification. Move on here. And just some other things to think about when procuring goods and services, obviously planning ahead. And when you get down to it, so this would be people in the department who are working with faculty members in terms of creating purchase requisitions. We use the EVA system. I think everybody knows the EVA system. And then obtaining required approvals through the PR flow. There is a paperwork flow or a purchase requisition flow associated with the EVA name, the commodity code, account code, budget code, all these sorts of things that you enter into EVA. Again, folks in the department, one good thing about grants, as I mentioned earlier, we follow the same type of process, whether it's you're buying things through E&G versus buying things through grants. It's the same process. Everything goes through EVA. So the department should be well equipped to know that, but since they use EVA a lot in their ordering. So we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about another big thing that we face on our grants, and a lot of questions that we ask is accounting services helps us with. And do we have anybody in accounting on the call? Excuse me, on the Zoom?
Yeah, this is Angela. I'm on here with you.
And I'm going to turn a lot of this over to Angela. And Angela, I didn't have your slides in time, but I would love for you to chime in and talk about this because we get asked this a lot, particularly for our faculty members who are doing human subject research. So for those of you that aren't familiar with it, so anytime when you do research involving human subjects, that there's obviously it's federally regulated for one, but there's several different sets of criteria involved. And we won't go into that today because that's a whole nother topic. But one of the biggest things that we ask about is, hey, Tom, or hey, sponsor program staff, can I budget in payments to pay or budget in monies to pay human subjects participants? Of course you can. It's vital. It's vital to pay human subjects so that your study has the maximum participation as possible so that you can collect the data and it can guide you in your research. So I asked Carla Linkus and her shop and I'm glad Angela, you came out, because there's a lot of questions for those people that have, what do I do? Petty cash, or can I use gift card? And Angela, do you want to talk about that?
Sure, I'll gladly talk a little bit about that. I won't keep you very long, but as far as gift cards, we don't have a tool or mechanism to really do gift cards at this time. So what we've been recommending is that you use MTurk. Some people call it Amazon Mechanical Turk or Prolific. Of those two, Prolific seems to be the best if you were able to do your research participation online. Prolific does not have as many bot responses as MTurk may have, so a lot of people are preferring to use Prolific. Prolific was also designed so that it's for institutional research. MTurk is designed for all types of businesses, but Prolific is specific to scientific research. So, and it was developed by another university to help other universities. So I think you'll find Prolific to be very helpful, but if you cannot do your research or your participants can't be done online, there we do have the option of Petty Cash, and Petty Cash comes with a lot of rules and regulations. We do have a Petty Cash procedure that you have to follow. There's a policy on the County Services website, and if you have to go that route, we do require that you read that policy before you participate. Also, it's subject to audit within our internal auditors, and they can come and audit you at any point in time to make sure that you are using those funds only to incentivize your participants. So that's the general concept of that. As it's saying on the slide, there is the option to do honorariums. An honorarium is when you elect to contribute to someone's participation, but it is not expected. If you ask a participant and you promise them money, you cannot do an honorarium. That's actually a payment of goods and services. So you can't promise them if you're doing an honorarium, but if there is something that you just wanted to give someone a $50 honorarium saying thank you for participating, and it's not an incentive to make them participate, then you can do an honorarium, but there's a special form that you need to fill out for that. And then of course there's the direct pay form. If a goods or service does not fall under the EVA guidelines, then you'll submit that through the direct pay, and that's usually the stipend payments. So that's the general concept that I have.
No, thanks, Angela, for that. And what we kind of try to coach up our faculty and who are conducting, let's go back to the human subject research. Yeah, take advantage of the two vendors that the university has already been approved to use, Mechanical Turk or Prolific, because not only will they manage and handle the human subject payment, but they'll also even help recruit or help provide strategies to help recruit participants and that sort of thing. Because Angela's right, we do have a lot of grants that still use petty cash that basically you're going to have cash that's offset from the grant, but you're going to have a pool of cash to where you got to keep up with. It's got to be locked and stowed appropriately and with a log. And the log can be somewhat problematic because the log's got to tie into who the person you just paid, right, the amount of money, so that it can be auditable, traceable, and we can reconcile it, right? So a lot of times our studies are sensitive, and so whereas you can't use an actual individual's name on the log, so then you have to create a key and all this stuff. So we're kind of new, at least in sponsored programs world, we're kind of new to the MTurk and Prolific, but from what I'm understanding from others who have used it, I think faculty members have been very pleased with using that, and it's been more, more streamlined and less, I guess, burdensome than keeping up with the petty cash. And again, thank you for Angela for the honorariums. Yeah, for the honorariums, sometimes we see that. I put some examples like many of our grants, there are outreach components to that where we're either providing workshops or conferences or whatever. But yes, please, you can actually hire speakers and pay them an honorarium. Again, this is just something that's essentially an appreciation. There's no, in there's no really expectations other than just paying them to show up and participate or teach a workshop or give a lecture, that sort of thing. So
Tom, before you
Yes,
go any further, there is a question in chat. Is there a guide regarding how to create an MTurk account and how the incentives are distributed through MTurk, or do we just create our own MTurk account?
That's actually a great question. Angela, do you know the specifics on how one can go about to access in Mechanical Turk?
Well, before you go in and access that through Amazon, you can actually search online for that information. But before you do that, you'll need the controller's office approval, and the controller's office is going to ask you for an explanation as to why you needed to use MTurk or Prolific, whichever one you decide to use, how that ties in with your grant, how many participants you're expecting, how much that's going to cost. And they also want the approval of your department head, the RB, then what's your RB signed agreement and approved agreement, as well as someone from sponsored programs to sign off and saying that they approve these things. And once you do that, then you submit a written presentation to the controller's office, which is usually Carla Linkus, but Deanna can review that as well. And then they will provide additional information if they have it. But I think you go in and you sign up with your own individual account. That way it is specific to you. But I cannot guarantee that. So I will get back to you with an honest, true answer on whether that's your own account or if we have an account assigned to Radford University. But I think it is your own account.
No, thank you for that, Angela. And it sounds very, very good. And what I've heard from other faculty members is that they've been really, pleased with working with Amazon. It's just it's kind of a new area in our office, so we need to certainly do our due diligence and investigating that too, so that we can properly advise faculty members. We'll skip. We'll move forward a little bit for sake of time. Wanted to talk about travel again. Redundant here, but follow policies and procedures with travel, and what that means is going through Chrome River, right? So meals, incidentals, and all that can certainly be charged on grants, and so either in terms of the grants, you have to have university defined policies and procedures which we do, but in terms of how it establishes its rates, or they ask you to use the GSA or the General Service Administration. Thankfully, Radford uses that. And I've created a link on the travel office website where you can get access to that. So again, this is just for your benefit and planning purposes. You can click on that link and it'll take you to a automated type page that you can click on where you're going, what state you're going to, what geographical area within that state. Usually they list most of the metropolitan areas of a state. So, I mean, if you're going somewhere really rural, it could be tough, but it can give you the actual per diem, the lodging rates and the per diem rates based on the time frame that you selected. So again, that's something that we can do for you on the pre-award budgeting piece, but it's good for you to know that way, as you're thinking about, projects or thinking about doing some traveling, that's good to know where that information is so that you can kind of get a feel for how things cost. And again, much like with your E&G funds, the travel is a two-step process for us as well. So you will submit your travel request like you would through your department, as if on E&G funds, and then subsequently, once you get back, then the travel reimbursement expense report you'll do. The extra step with that, if it is grant funded related, then, it goes to your department and then that hierarchy to approve, but it also go to sponsor programs for us to review as well.
Tom, can I ask a question about cash advance or travel advance?
Absolutely, yes.
So I'm going to be for the next 3 summers traveling in sub-Saharan African countries, and there's just the only way to do most of the business is with cash. And so I'm gonna actually just need large amounts of cash, and I don't know how to keep track of it other than I just thought I'd go to Staples and buy like a receipt book and to keep track of everything. Is that a suitable way to go about it, or do you have any advice?
Yes, Stockton, and we can certainly get with the travel folks to make sure, but here's how I know it, and here's the precedents that we have had before on our grants, right? So we've had a few international grants since I've been here, or shall I say faculty members that are traveling remote. And it took a while for the university to, and this is going back a few years, but it took a while for the university to kind of understand that. But Stockton, you're exactly right. The places that we were going to, you have to pay cash
Yeah.
for everything, right? And including like, yeah, it's a different world over there depending on where you're going, and cash is prevalent. So yeah, there have been precedents in the past to where, yeah, faculty members can carry cash over. And like you said, keep those receipt logs, because what we found is when you pay cash, and it depends on where you're going, but if you're going into remote parts of the world or quite, simply third countries, they're not going to probably provide you with receipts and all
Yeah,
that.
that's most of the case. It's like it's all just hand to hand, everything's good. And I just want to make sure that I'm doing the right thing with accounting.
Yeah, no, that's great due diligence. And again, we'll shore it up with the travel folks here on campus, but I can tell you on the grant related side and I can let Angela speak to that, because she can talk about what would be required on the university side. But on the grant side is obviously it's important for us that we have that auditing and documentation trail. So what you had proposed with the receipt book and all that seems like a prudent way to go about it for sure.
Okay.
Unfortunately, we do request receipts, and so I'll have to do more digging into your proposal of a receipt book. I think maybe if you could get someone else to sign off each time, like, I understand you're in a foreign country, that may be difficult, but let me check on that to be sure. Because I know that auditors are going to require us to have the actual physical receipt. But we do also understand there are certain situations. So let me just check on that to be sure. Unfortunately, I'm new to this university and I'm not sure all the rules here, but I will definitely check into that to make sure that will be acceptable.
I appreciate it.
Thank you for that, Angela. And yeah, obviously we want to do our due diligence, and especially in accordance to audit. I will say we kind of did, if it helps, and again, we'll need to have these discussions offline with Stockton individually. We did have projects in the past where we went to, I think, Malawi in Africa, where everything had to be cash only, and including like paying somebody extra to drive you around places, because you can't trust the people driving you around, right? So yeah, I think we can go back, Stockton, and look at what again, it's previous administration, because it's happened a few years ago, of what was approved in the past, and Angela, see if that'll work with you all.
Yeah, I'll be able to do offline then.
Yeah, and I'll check on that. Just make sure that we are within auditing standards and not violating anything.
Absolutely.
But the petty cash, getting the travel advance is not an issue. That would be definitely the way you want to go with that. It's just whether, the having valid documentation. I just need to make sure that will work.
Yeah, and again, something that we see on grants on the travel advance is very, very common, particularly if you have students on your projects, that Obviously, a lot of our grants, there's some form of scholarship that happens, right? So we're either presenting or publishing, but if we're going to present or going to conferences to disseminate all the wonderful things we're doing on the projects, then we often find times where students need that sort of advanced travel, because obviously, most of the travel, normal travel, is reimbursement, and sometimes they can't bear that expense up front. So that's another thing that we see a lot too, or questions that we get. We've got the last slide. I just want to focus on this real fast because the grant management piece, to sum all this together, right? As you buy things, as you hire people, as you travel, there's an account reconciliation that happens, and sponsored programs will review to make sure that the accounts, again, going back to the auditing standpoint, making sure that the accounts are appropriately charged. And if there are any unallowable costs, then they're moved off, accordingly. One big thing too, when you get grants that have indirect cost on them, indirect cost means that the cost at the university, the expense that the university bears in terms of running its external funding operations in terms of research, scholarship, and creative service, we have a rate that's approved by the government. So we distribute that rate back, and a good chunk of that rate actually goes into our seed grant. So if you ever wondered where Sponsored Programs gets its internal money and we're up on time, it's our seed grant. And then some other things. One big thing about Project Closeout is reporting. Make sure that you understand what's required and expected of you. Oftentimes we'll find that we have progress reporting that are interims, finals, and then the financial report. Sponsored Programs will work with you and the financial reporting office on the financial report. But I just wanted to focus in on any progress reporting. Make sure that you understand what's due, right? Because that could very well impact your ability to receive other grants. Because I know at one time NSF was putting faculty members on the bad list, I guess I should say, for non-performance, and that was prohibiting people. Not here, I wouldn't say here, but at other places they were, being prohibited from receiving other grants. And yeah, so the sponsored invoices, one big question. The reason I had it in there, and I'm sorry we're 1 minute over, which is very important. How does the money come in? 99% of the time when we get grant awards, let's say you get a grant award for $50,000, 99% of the time the check is not attached to that award, right? So we front you the $50,000, and then behind the scenes, we go and ask the sponsor for reimbursement based on how you spent it. So again, but periodically you'll get contacted by sponsors saying, hey, send me an invoice, or hey, we haven't gotten an invoice from you lately. Direct all that to your Sponsored Programs administrator, and they will take care of that. Sorry for the technical issues on the slides. Again, this is our first time kickoff event, and as with anything, we'll have to pick ourselves up and dust ourselves off and repolish everything to make sure our presentations are much smoother going forward. But I definitely appreciate everybody hanging in there. I know we're a couple minutes after the hour. If I can hang out a little bit more, if you all have questions, or otherwise, there's my contact information. Please feel free to contact me directly, or any member of the staff for that matter. We'll be glad to help you. We're here to help facilitate, not impede, and just offer good, viable solutions to problems so that you can solve all the wonderful things that you do for Radford University. So I appreciate it again. And if there are no other questions, I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the day.
Thank you, Tom.
Thanks. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Bye.
Can you let me see all the meeting?
I only got, he never showed